So we'll do now the third of our three orientation presentations. This one is on the topic of leasing process review. And here I'd like to invite David McDuffie to present.
Thanks, Eric. Certainly appreciate the opportunity to speak to the task force this morning. And again, I'm David McDuffie. I'm the chief of our projects and coordination branch with the Office of Renewable Energy Programs in Sterling, Virginia. And so I'll very briefly run through our primarily our area identification process and touch a little bit on the leasing process. So if we'll go ahead and jump to the next slide. Our process is divided into essentially 4 different phases. We have a planning and analysis phase. It looks at identifying wind energy areas. Once those areas are identified, we move into a leasing phase, issue a lease, and then once a developer starts conducting additional surveys on the lease, that brings us into a site assessment phase. And then finally, we go into a construction and operations phase if a plan for a wind facility is approved by BOEM. So if we click one more. So we'll focus primarily on that planning and analysis phase and touch again a little bit on the leasing. So if we go on to the next slide, we can zoom in to that phase. There we go. And the planning and analysis, if you click one more time, and start with the request for interest. That's what has been published for the Gulf of Mexico. And I'll talk a little bit more about the various steps through the next few slides. But I did want to point out here on the bottom, you'll see there are multiple opportunities for task force engagement. And it's critical, particularly in this beginning planning and analysis phase. While the task force is certainly available for engagement throughout all 4 phases of our process, this initial phase is critically important to get that input as we're looking to identify areas that are suitable for leasing. It's important that those areas are indeed suitable and planned appropriately to help ensure success as we move forward with the remaining phases of our process. So we'll move on to the next slide. You can kind of think of the area ID process as a series of boxes that continually get smaller and smaller until we've identified a suitable wind energy area. So we'll start out kind of at a high level and look at a larger planning area, remove areas perhaps that we may not even have jurisdiction to lease in, such as a national marine sanctuary, and then we'll likely reduce that area if we go one more into an area that we'll publish. We can click one more, Eric. And so we'll identify an area for the request for interest, which will be published in the Federal Register and essentially ask 2 questions. It'll ask industry, where do you think you have an interest in developing in this box? And also to any other stakeholder user of the OCS, is there information that we should be considering as we move through our process? Are there any issues, concerns that we should be taking into account? And so this is where we are in the Gulf of Mexico. The request for interest has been published. And if we click on one more, that information will be taken in. Likely some additional refinements will be made to that box until we get to what we call a call area. This area would be again published in the Federal Register in what's known as a call for information and nominations. And similar to the RFI, it's asking industry, where do you feel it's important to develop in this box and submit a nomination for a project. And then also again asking generally, is there additional information that we should be considering as we continue along in this process? So the RFI and the call can be duplicative, and in many cases, we have started directly with a call for information and nominations and skip that RFI process. We might do that if we feel that we have sufficient information on industry interest in the area. We've collected an appropriate level of data and stakeholder input to go ahead and identify an appropriate call area. So we'll receive the information in response to the call for information. And if we click one more, that'll bring us to the end of our process where we may identify wind energy areas. The wind energy area serves really two purposes. It sets the kind of the baseline for us to conduct additional environmental analysis under the National Environmental Policy Act, looking specifically at the consequences of issuing a lease. And then it also serves as the basis for identifying a lease area that we would put out to sale. The wind energy area could constitute an entire lease area, or if we click one more time, the wind energy area could be split up into multiple lease areas where portions are not leased, or perhaps the wind energy area is not leased at all. So there's some flexibility there once that wind energy area is identified before we get to actually offering a lease for sale. So if we can go to the next slide. Rather than leave you with a series of boxes, I thought a real world example might be helpful. So this is the New York Bight off of New York and New Jersey, where we recently completed the area ID process earlier this year. Go ahead and click one more time. These are some of the, these are the initial areas that we started out with. These were developed by the state of New York after a significant amount of data collection, stakeholder input, and analysis. The state proposed these areas to BOEM as call areas. If you click one more time, BOEM overlaid these areas with some additional analysis in existing information on user activity and military activity, fishing areas, vessel transit. And if you click again, we made some adjustments, and that brought us to the call areas that were published. If you can, there you go. So these areas in blue were put out in a call for information and nominations, and we took that information. If you go to the next slide, we developed draft wind energy areas based on that information in green. So we went from the black areas and the outlined areas there from the call areas and narrowed those down to draft wind energy areas. So we made quite a bit of reduction in area there. How did we do that? If you go to the next slide, Eric. We looked at the industry nominations. This is a heat map of where those were located. You can see the draft wind energy areas and the diagonally hatched areas. If you go to the next slide. We also looked at fisheries information. This is a relative use index that looks at both fishing vessel movement patterns as well as fishing revenue, and combines that into a relative use index with the darker colors being the higher use areas. So those draft wind energy areas were designed to avoid the higher use areas. Go to the next slide. We also looked in a similar fashion to vessel traffic patterns and use. And again, those draft wind energy areas avoiding the higher use activity in the area. Next. We also work closely with the Coast Guard on proposed safety fairways that they're working on. You'll notice here one fairway cuts through several of the draft wind energy areas. And we continue to work with Coast Guard on that effort. Go to the next slide. We also work closely with Department of Defense. They provided information on their ongoing operational training and testing activities. You'll notice in the red areas, again, a little bit of overlap there with some of the draft wind energy areas. One more slide. That brought us to the final wind energy areas that were announced just a few months ago, earlier this year. And you'll notice we made some adjustments there between the draft and the final. primarily related to the Coast Guard proposed fairway and some DoD activities. Okay, if we can go to the next slide. So this is an example of how one might divide up a wind energy area into lease areas. This is the Hudson South wind energy area within the New York Bight. This area was divided into six potential lease areas, roughly 80,000 acres apiece. We've added some proposed vessel transit lanes. And then you'll notice the green areas to the north were not divided at all. We felt that those were appropriately sized for a lease area. And then what's not on the map, or even farther to the north, are two of the wind energy areas that were identified, but not identified as proposed lease areas. However, they do remain wind energy areas. Again, going back to that flexibility, once you identify the wind energy area, and what ultimately is offered for sale may not be a one-to-one match. So if we can go to the next slide. Again, going back to our 4 phases, and if you can click one more time, Eric. Focusing on the leasing aspect, I'll just briefly touch on this. Once those wind energy areas are identified and some proposed lease areas are also identified, we would put those out in a proposed sale notice, receive additional comments. That notice would include auction format and procedures, lease stipulations. And then after we receive that information, we may make additional adjustments on what those lease areas could look like, as well as the auction format and lease stipulations. We would publish then a final sale notice, have an auction seminar for potential bidders, hold an auction, and then issue those leases. And so I'll stop there on the leasing. That's certainly can be a topic for another presentation and perhaps a future task force meeting. But that generally is how we operate the Area ID process and get through our leasing to execute a lease. And if you click one more, that is the last slide. So again, appreciate the opportunity and look forward to answering any questions anybody has. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, David, and thank you as well to Idrissa and to Jabed for your presentation.